Mousehole, December 1981. The whole nation mourns the loss of the crew of the Penlee Lifeboat Solomon Brown. 8 men who gave their lives in an heroic, though vain attempt to save 8 others aboard the coaster Union Star. 5 years have passed since that tragedy, and though time may have healed all but the deepest wounds for the families of the 2 crews, there is still, in this corner of Cornwall, a lingering doubt about what happened that night, a feeling that the rescue operation wasn't as well handled as it could have been. It's a doubt which has been fueled by rumours that a 3rd ship was lost in that same storm and on that same night. This film is about that 3rd ship.
Nothing has ever been done. Nobody's even told us he's missing. Just a little policeman that had to knock on the door and say it's missing. They get all the nice jobs, don't they? We have written to the House of Commons, to our local MPs. You name it, we've written to it. But quite frankly, I honestly don't believe anybody cares.
The coaster Mark was a 950-ton vessel carrying general cargo. 2 days before the Penlee disaster, she sailed from Plymouth for Italy. Neither she nor her crew of 6 were ever heard of again. Captain Brian O'Brien was her master. 40 years a seaman and decorated for distinguished service during the war, he was former captain of the luxury liner QE2 and of the ill-fated Atlantic Conveyor, which sank during the Falklands War a year later.
To me, he was fantastic. A very good navigator, a very good skipper. He had the experience, he had his pilot's license, he had everything. And to me, he was very good.
Captain O'Brien took 5 men with him on that last fatal voyage. Roy Jones, the chief officer, aged 47, from Liverpool. Bernard Murrin, aged 34, from Ireland. Ron Amos, the engineer, from Hampshire. Len Martin from Brighton, who was 42. And 16-year-old Geoffrey Score, the youngest crew member who'd never been to sea before. Len Martin's daughter remembers the day her father joined the Mark.
He was pleased to get a job. He'd been out of work for about a year, so he was definitely pleased that he was going to be working again.
Did he tell you anything about the vessel?
No, he didn't, because he hadn't even seen it when he called me to say that he was leaving.
The ship Len Martin joined that day had a checkered history. Built in Holland in 1963, she was originally called the Breehorn. She was sold and became Tide II, sold again to become the Seamark, and in October 81 she was sold once more and renamed Mark. Her owner lived and sometimes still stays at this small house in Rymer Grove, Liverpool. His name is George Lividaris. He's a Greek national and has proved impossible to find. We've tried, family solicitors have tried, even the Seamen's Union has tried, all without success. These 2 men were on the Lividaris payroll until the 14th of December that year, when they both left because of a dispute over pay. David Evans, a deckhand, and Terry Davies, who was the boatswain, probably wouldn't be alive today if they hadn't quit the ship just 2 hours before she left Shoreham.
She had a concrete patch in the hull on forepeak, which was stopping a leak. And generators, the belts used to go all the time on the generators. We had no lights and nothing.
I found out that the locking bars that run across the hatch, they have bottle screws each side. But most of them, well, I'd say 3 or 4 of those, the threads had gone on them.
Now, how important are locking bars and bottle screws?
They're very important, locking bars on the ship, because they hold down the hatches, they make it secure.
The steering gear, we had trouble with the steering gear in the Bristol Channel. And we had to go on the wheel, do it manually, you know, on the wheel.
What about the generator and the engine? What was that like?
Well, the generator, which kept the lights and everything else moving on board the ship, the belts kept breaking on that, the belts. They had a lot of trouble with these belts, you know. And the engineer did say to the owner that he wanted these belts repaired. And the owner said, well, we'll leave them until we get back to the UK. Leave them till we get back to the UK and I'll see them myself. But I don't know whether they was ever done.
The Mark sailed not under the British ensign, but the flag of Panama, a so-called flag of convenience, which meant she wasn't subject to the same stringent safety rules that apply to British merchant vessels. After picking up a cargo of China clay from Teignmouth, the Mark took on fuel and water in Plymouth on December the 17th. Her destination was La Spezia in Italy. She sailed at 6:30 that evening. The weather was good, with a fair wind from the north. Captain O'Brien, the master who'd come out of retirement because he wanted to get the sea out of his blood, told his family and his crew that this was to be his last voyage. It wasn't a glamorous liner nor a supertanker, but he was determined to get his ship to Italy on time in 9 days. Meanwhile, out in the Atlantic Ocean, one of the worst storms in living memory was brewing. It hadn't yet reached the Channel, and even if it did, judging from previous trips, Captain O'Brien must have been confident he could handle it. Coasting is a highly competitive trade, and crews are often under pressure to get their cargoes away on time, no matter what the weather.
The owner would have pushed him into going out. On ships like this, the Panamanian, flying the Panamanian flag, no union involved aboard the ships, that he would have took it. You know, he would have been forced to take it out, in other words, in any force wind, you know.
Did that happen?
It did happen. We went out from, well, we left Eastham and we were moored off in the Mersey. And the pilot said he would not take us out. It was force 11. We had a weather report to say that it was decreasing to 10, which is still a storm. And we thought we'd be there till the next morning. But we went out.
The usual route was to stay close to the English coast until the ship reached the Lizard and then turn south. That way, if bad weather blew up, she could run for shelter. But by the 19th, the Mark should have been well past the French island of Ushant, and since she wasn't seen and didn't radio her owner, it's impossible to be certain what happened. If she'd had a recurrence of her generator trouble, then she may have been behind schedule reaching the Lizard, where a coaster of her description was seen nearly 48 hours after she left Plymouth. December the 19th, 1981, saw one of the worst storms in living memory in the English Channel. By 5:30 that morning, the Met Office were already forecasting gales from the south between force 8 and severe force 9. As we now know, the wind in fact reached hurricane force later on that day. If the Mark's skipper did decide to take the Lizard route, and as we'll see, there's reason to think she did, then she and the Union Star faced mountainous seas and appalling visibility.
Union Star, London Radio. Is there any change in your situation, sir? We found that one of our fuel tanks is full of water. We have just, well, at the moment we're trying to use our starboard tank, and we're hoping that one is okay. Well, we're just hoping that...
By coincidence, the Union Star was also a Dutch-designed coaster. At 6 p.m. on the 19th, she'd broken down to the west of Mounts Bay. The gale was reaching its awful climax as the Union Star's captain tried to get his waterlogged engine started. All the time, his ship was drifting ever closer to the rocks near the Tatadoo lighthouse, driven on by the storm from the south.
126 degrees.
From their lookout at Gwenup Head, the Coast Guard used radar to try and identify which of 3 ships in the area was the Union Star. The radar plotted positions at 15-minute intervals, trying to calculate how long before the Union Star would hit the shore.
1945 position report.
By 7:45, it was clear the Union Star was the radar Echo drifting fast inshore. The 2 other Echoes hadn't apparently moved much and were assumed to be ships hove to in the storm. Neither ship ever identified itself, although if they had done so, it could have saved vital time. The second Echo we've discovered was a Spanish trawler called the Gaztel El Teruk. Her skipper said later that there'd been a fight on board between the crew and that he'd been unable to use his radio at all that night.
141 degrees.
The third ship was never identified, but when we traced her radar bearings, we found that she too had apparently been drifting into the bay. It's this Echo that some believe could have been the Mark, also broken down, unable to make radio contact, and as helpless as the Union Star. What happened to her remains a mystery, because by 8 p.m. the Coast Guard had turned its attention solely to the Union Star.
The sector officer who had been in there checking on the Union Star left at 7:45, 1945, leaving the auxiliary in the lookout, trying to determine and track the Union Star's further position towards the coast. And in order to do that, they switched to a smaller scale, which put the other two echoes off the radar.
So you didn't watch the other two echoes after 8:45?
That is, my understanding is correct, yes.
Why not?
Because the Coast Guard's primary aim was to deal with a ship in distress, which was the Union Star, and there was no other distress reported, and it was quite right for all the effort the Coast Guard was put in on the ship that was in trouble. And we had no reason to believe that the other two echoes were in any trouble whatever, either then or now.
So, by dawn on the 20th, that third ship had gone. But was it the Mark? There is evidence from earlier on the 19th to suggest that it may have been. At 3 o'clock on that afternoon, the 19th, a coaster fitting the description of the Mark was seen making slow progress around the Lizard. The man who saw her is an acknowledged expert on shipping and is certain she was a Dutch-designed coaster of around 1,000 tons. And nearly 12 hours later, Peter Mitchell, the coxswain of the Lizard lifeboat, also saw a coaster in Mounts Bay. He'd launched his boat to search for survivors from the Penlee disaster.
I would say approximately 2:30 in the morning, I was at the helm in the wheelhouse, and I saw lights ahead of me. I thought possibly it was the tug that had been operating in the area, and I called or summoned two of my crew from the after cabin of the lifeboat and asked them what they thought. And this vessel passed our bow probably about 500 or 600 yards ahead of us. We could see all her lights. She was wallowing and probably making a speed of 2 knots, keeping her head into the weather and heading in the direction of south to southwest, I should think. We decided that it wasn't a tug, and she looked to us very much like a small coasting vessel. And she went off, as I say, to the south or the southwest.
If the ship which Peter Mitchell saw was the third radar echo, then she'd clearly been pushed back into the bay by the storm. Yet all the while no one had noticed or thought to find out if this vessel too was in trouble. And there was another sighting of an unidentified ship a few miles to the west. This time the Scilly's lifeboat, also helping in the search for the Penlee lifeboat, saw a ship with no deck-level navigation lights near the Runnelstone buoy. The vessel was taken to be the tug, which had gone to try and tow the Union Star out of danger. But it couldn't have been, because the tug had already left the scene.
Well, we have no evidence whatever that there was any other ship in distress, least of all the Mark, on that part of the coast that night. All our efforts were rightly concentrated on the Union Star, and we were not diverting any of our attention to ships that were not apparently in distress, and there were none others.
But you can be sure, can you, that while you were dealing with the Union Star, there wasn't something else happening round the corner or just out to sea?
You can never be sure. We only have to take the reports as they come in. And all I can say is that there was no other distress reported to us that night.
That there was a third ship in Mounts Bay that night isn't in doubt. What is surprising is that she at no time made herself known to the Coast Guard, who were desperately searching for wreckage and survivors from the Solomon Brown and the Union Star. And despite worldwide publicity of the disaster, neither the ship's master nor the owner ever came forward afterwards. Therefore, the possibility exists that the ship was lost in Mounts Bay and that that ship was the Mark. It's the view taken by one of the most experienced seamen in the area, the Penzance pilot, Captain Eric Kemp.
I think there's a wealth of evidence to say that the Mark was here. The first evidence that she had been lost in this area was the sighting of a life raft and a body floating close to it, close to the New Year, some 12 days after the disaster. And this was rapidly followed by the finding of a lifeboat on this beach, which both clearly said they were from the Mark, although the body was never recovered. And this was followed by the finding of more wreckage and another life raft, all within the confines of Mounts Bay. And no wreckage of the Mark has ever been found outside of Mounts Bay itself.
11 days after she'd sailed from Plymouth, the Mark's wooden lifeboat was found washed up on Marazion Beach. And as Eric Kemp said, it wasn't the only wreckage to come ashore from the Mark. Wooden hatch covers were found too nearby, and on the 30th of that month, 2 life rafts were found floating off Land's End. Then, on January the 2nd, a life belt was found on Pra Sands near Marazion. The wreckage was strewn across just 10 miles of coastline, but if the Mark sank in Mounts Bay, where's the wreck itself? Ronnie Dunn is an expert commercial diver who knows the bay well. He says there were reports at the time of something on the seabed, but it's never been thoroughly investigated.
Sort of talking to people at Newlyn, the trawler people, they did mention that they had snagged their nets on something on the bottom.
That was out here somewhere,
That was at the back of the Mopus, which is sort of it's a piece of ground about 3.5 to 4 miles from St Michael's Mount, which comes up pretty shallow. But the actual wreckage was, when we were told, at the back of the Mopus. We didn't really know how far from the back of the Mopus. And at the time we said, yeah, well, sure, we'd go and sort of dive on it. But we also got the report in the meantime that it was in about 350 to 400 feet of water. So it was too deep for us, and that was more or less it. As far as I know, nobody investigated it after that.
No search has ever been carried out to prove if there is a new wreck in the bay, and there is therefore no way of showing if it was a ship or just rock which snagged the fishermen's nets. Until the wooden lifeboat came ashore, nothing else was known about the Mark, and while the local papers in the southwest continued giving prominence to the Penlee disaster, the fate of the Mark warranted little interest. Though in Deeside, where most of the crew lived, the story was front-page news for a while. The elusive George Liverdaris received £100,000 in his insurance for the Mark, but it wasn't till last year that any of the bereaved got compensation. 2 families only received a share, in an out-of-court settlement claiming Liverdaris was negligent in the care of his vessel. The rest got nothing, least of all an explanation of what had happened.
They've never even sent out a search. Nothing has ever been done. Well, nothing that we know of. Nobody's telling us anything. Nobody's even told us he's missing. So, you know, just a little policeman that had to knock on the door and say it's missing. They get all the nice jobs, don't they? And that was it. Nothing. We have written to the House of Commons, to our local MPs. You name it, we've written to it. But quite frankly, I honestly don't believe anybody cares.
For 5 years, the families of the Mark have suffered not just the loss of their loved ones, but the cold formality of the law, which says that because the Mark was foreign registered, because no Mayday was heard by the British Coast Guard, there's no requirement for an investigation. And more painful still, the scattered wreckage in Mounts Bay drew her into the tragedy of the Penlee disaster. However, in our research for this programme, we've discovered new evidence which could explain what happened. It begins with 2 sightings of wreckage not in Mounts Bay, but 100 miles out in the Channel. On December the 19th, a tanker called British Ghent saw a life raft floating 35 miles northwest of Ushant. Then on December the 20th, a ship called Irish Oak reported seeing an orange and white wooden lifeboat floating upturned in mid-channel. And on December the 23rd, the vessel Roebuck reported a similar wooden boat and a life raft in a position just to the east. At first, the wooden boat was thought to have come from a ship called the Bobricks, which sank on the 13th of December away to the east. But as we'll see, that was almost certainly a mistake. The Mark lifeboat came ashore around the 28th, and it too is orange and white. In fact, the boat still exists and is being rebuilt by David Richards, boatswain on the Salonian ferry. He confirmed this boat fits the description of the one seen in mid-channel. The question to be answered is whether it's feasible that the wreckage from the Mark floated out of Mounts Bay when the ship sank, or whether the Mark went down somewhere near Ushant, as the Coast Guard believes, and that all the wreckage found floated 100 miles north and ended up in one small corner of Cornwall. Professor Roger Mott is Dean of the Faculty of Maritime Studies at Plymouth Polytechnic. He analysed for us the weather, tide and wave data for the whole of the Mark's voyage. First, he discounted the idea that the sighting mid-channel was wreckage from the Bobricks.
Well, having analysed the weather data and the sea data for that period, for the period after the 13th, the general trend of the weather was largely from the west, so it's highly unlikely that that wreckage could have come from that source.
Now, that wreckage came ashore here at Marazion eventually, we believe it did. Could it, as the Coast Guard believe, have come from as far south as Ushant?
Oh, certainly, yes. It's quite likely that it would have done. And again, having considered the data over the period in question, both from looking at the sea state charts and the historical weather data here from the meteorological bulletins that we receive, it seems highly likely that that's the source of it. The strong winds during that period that occurred, and we did record winds of up to 60 and 70 knots in gusts, were all from a southerly direction. And it's quite likely that that sort of wreckage would make quite a bit of leeway to the north. So
but it's an awful long way to travel. If the Mark sank off Ushant, then that wreckage travelled 100 miles, 110 miles up into Mounts Bay.
Yes. Well, obviously, if Mounts Bay hadn't have been in the way, it would travel a lot further than that. It just so happens that Mounts Bay was in the direct line of the drift of that wreckage, and so the wreckage did finish up in Mounts Bay.
But the wreckage was all of different size and weight. A wooden boat, 2 life rafts, a lifebelt and hatchboards. Could they all drift at the same speed and come ashore so close together?
Well, over the period from the 27th through to the 30th, there was fairly light winds recorded of a southerly, south-southwesterly direction. So this general wreckage could have been oscillating and floating in the tide offshore, going backwards and forwards with the ebb and flood of tide, and then eventually finishing up in Mounts Bay a little while later. It wouldn't have all gone ashore at exactly the same hour on the same day. It would have gone ashore over a period of time.
One final question then, and again going back to the wreckage that was seen out here. What prospect of the ship, the Mark, having sunk, if it did, on the 19th, in the same storm as the Penlee, somewhere in Mounts Bay?
Oh, that's highly unlikely that it did sink in Mounts Bay, because initially the wind was northerly over the time in question for a small amount of time, but it was southerly, quite strong southerly over a couple of days, and it would have come ashore much earlier. So it obviously had to travel, it had to be at sea for a long period of time for the dates to fit in, if you like.
But you're confident then that the Mark sank off Ushant?
Yes, I'm quite confident, having looked at the meteorological data and the oceanographic data, the sea state charts, and all the rest of the available information that we have, that she sank off Ushant.
Despite the theories, we shall probably never know exactly what did happen to the Mark. If she sank in Mounts Bay, then she may have been smashed to pieces on the bottom during the gales that followed during January of 1982. On the other hand, if she sank in mid-channel, then she lies in deep water, and the wreck will probably never be found. The sad truth is the Mark was one of many flag of convenience ships which disappear around the world every year. And all that makes her famous, and why she's not been forgotten, is a sad coincidence that she may have disappeared in the same area and at the same time as the lifeboat Solomon Brown and that other coaster, the Union Star.
The Mark has British people just as well as the lifeboat did. I feel very deeply about the lifeboat. One of the lifeboatmen worked for me, the second coxswain. I don't wish to rake those memories over at this time of year at all. But just the same, there are families of the Mark in this country now who have the same worries, that they don't know what happened to their loved ones, that they disappeared, that a mother can see her 16-year-old son disappear out of the kitchen with just a note and then find a policeman to tell her that he's gone and will never come back. It's not fair, it's not right, and I would have thought our government would have had more compassion on its own people as to at least try to find out. There's never been a proper inquiry upon the Mark. For that reason, I speak out, and I don't like raking up the past whatsoever.
Well, we went away for Christmas and we came back about the 29th of December, and a policeman knocked on the door that morning to tell us that the ship was missing, well, not heard of, and that was the first and last that we heard.